right direction. But I don't think there was quite the sense then of, we know exactly what needs to be done. I think the difference between now and then is truly the belief that we have this beautiful engine, just give us the fuel, and we will lead to some incredible discoveries, and we think clinical impact. Now, it won't happen in 5 years, it may not happen in 10. But I think that the vision for getting there is so much clearer now than it was when you doubled the budget.
So I didn't say this in my opening remarks, but Chairman Upton and I are really planning to develop big legislation around this whole series of conversations and hearings. And one thing that'll really help us, because Congress is not inclined nowadays with the current budget situation to say, okay, we're going to double the NIH budget. But I think, and I think one reason why I'm the co-chair of this is because I think if we can say, the researchers have told us that this is different, that if we really increase funding and guarantee steady funding, it's not just an increase of funding, it's a guarantee that it's not going to go away next year, then here's what we think we can do with that funding so that we know what we're spending it on it. And I think that's the challenge that we would put out to all of you as you make your recommendations.
But what I want to stress is it's not just the money. That's a key part of it. But also it's the protections, but also the excitement. And some of this is to make people realize, to set audacious goals that people can get behind, but also make everybody feel like they're part of this, including the patients and including healthy individuals who just say, I have been told and I understand it, I get it, that if I sign up to be a long-term participant, they're going to learn things about what medication I'm taking or what medication I'm not taking or what diseases I get or what diseases I don't get. And this is all part, it could be part of national pride. And that's where I think some of these comparisons saying, why are we going to we developed the playbook and we're letting other countries now run with it. I would think there'd be some national pride to say, no, we're not going with that.
Yeah,
And well put. I agree with this 100%, 110%. Matter of fact, you could also argue that right now we can have short-term goals and longer-term goals. We have all the technology in place. We have basically the potential to really create an economic engine for biotechnology and biological research, because if you look at just the country and what other areas are we going to be potentially seeing tremendous growth in? We're probably not going to have twice as many cars. We're probably not going to have twice as many stereos or things like this. But this is an era, it's a part of science and biology and medicine that is going to be a game changer. So if we lose leadership now, we're basically not going to be able to catch up. This is the moment. We have all the technology. We invented most of the technology in this country, and we need to capitalize it. And we can have short-term goals, some of the things we discussed around the table to facilitate things, and then longer-term, visionary, bold goals. But all these things, even the short goals, I think will have some tangible endpoints in terms of jobs, products, and ultimately reducing the cost of healthcare. Because although it sounds like personalized medicine is going to be expensive, you have to do all the sequencing and all this stuff. In fact, we overtreat most people in, I won't speak of all diseases, I can't general, but in cancer, most of the treatments are not targeted. If we could not treat those patients, one, we would basically save them the toxicity, we would save cost, and we could basically enroll them in clinical trials for therapies that potentially could really help them, instead of treating them with things that are not. So in the end, I really believe that as the technology goes down in price, even today, with today's prices, we can actually see a paradigm where if we're doing this thoughtfully and really with the molecular intelligence, if you will, we can probably reduce the cost of healthcare eventually.
So we've got about, I've had my back to you the whole time, sorry, but we've got about 15 or 20 minutes left, and I wonder, are there any questions from the audience or our wonderful panelists here today?
There's one over there.
Okay.
Good morning, I'm Alan Rudolph, Vice President of Research at Colorado state. Thank you for putting this together. I come from the perspective of having been at DARPA investing in personalized medicine 15 years ago, then CEO of a diagnostic company trying to predict who would go from mild cognitively impaired into Alzheimer's. And now in academia, where I agree the students of what we're trying to do in terms of recognizing their awareness in healthcare and participating in these kinds of things is important to get like that comment. I really wanted to talk about sort of the proof paradigms for personalized medicine. Much of the discussion we've had has been around chronic diseases where the time to predict etiology of what's going to happen takes a long time and generates a lot of cost in the system. And the point I want to make is about time, because we're all trying, I think, in this discussion to predict something about the outcome of an individual population. And I think the success of what we talk about in the future will hang in the balance of paradigms that we choose to see this prediction come to fruition. And I'd like to suggest that the sectors that we think about that problem are important. The chronic disease paradigm is an important one, but I'd like to suggest that the infectious disease paradigm, in which the time course of activity from health and wellness to disease is much compressed. This is an area that we know we've seen a lot of activity on in the last years. We're faced with another outbreak of zoonotic disease. It's an area where government will have to play a role because the industry sector has not recognized infectious disease as a profit-making endeavor, the chronic nature of disease and the industry of serving that. So I think with antimicrobial resistance and infectious disease upon us as a huge issue in the healthcare system, I'd like to suggest that this is a paradigm in the time constant of looking at success in the predictive medicine case. Now, there's been some very interesting studies that show with longitudinal sampling, you can actually predict who will come down with a variety of inflammatory diseases. It suffers the same complexity issues that many of you brought out in the context of discussing this topic. But I'd suggest that it's an interesting area to consider because governments, even outside the U.S., have taken this up. The innovative medical initiative in Europe is a big public-private partnership that's generated a lot of interest and activity in antimicrobial resistance and infectious disease. So I'd love to hear your comments on this proof paradigm. Yes, we've got great successes in CF and others, and I think BRCA1's another great opportunity to look at cancer more predictive of disease. But the infectious disease paradigm is interesting because I think in the context of public-private partnerships, the government has a lot more to say and do perhaps in leading the industry and the regulatory and payment system in this. And we face it in an endemic annual basis. Thank you.
So I'm not an infectious disease person, but I will comment. So we are heavily invested in that notion right now here at National Jewish Health. We are an international center for mycobacterial diseases. In fact, just last week, we had samples sent to us from outside the country related to know the antimicrobial resistance of TB, which we were able to do with molecular diagnostics in 24 hours, turn it around, and that means the appropriate treatment gets started from the beginning. You don't have to wait 12 weeks where the patient is progressing and could die. So I completely agree. The other practical thing is that this area is much less regulated than the human diagnostics, and so it actually has less barriers, and I think it mitigates the huge public health problem that we could identify and tackle.
Yeah, I'm just going to second everything you said. My answer, and I keep coming back to this, is Registry and Clinical Trials Network. The National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, they have a pediatric critical care network now. And some of that targets infectious disease. So again, the more we know through the networks, it's harder to get consent if somebody's really sick and on a ventilator, but there might be ways around that. The other thing is, I will tell you, there are many chronic diseases that involve infection. Cystic fibrosis is one of the worst. So we need help with antibiotics and CF. And even now, with all the new treatments, the patients will have damage that lead to chronic infection. We know that for sure. So I guess I'm just seconding what you're saying.
And I would third, we really didn't talk about infectious diseases at all, but just keep in mind, what's game-changing that's going on is, of course, that these same technologies that can now very inexpensively reading out an entire human genome, to read out a microbial genome is trivial because they're teeny. So, I speak with pride to say just last week, Science Magazine published this beautiful paper from some of our grantees, where they had sequenced the complete genomes, which are small, of 99 isolates of Ebola, to help really inform and figure out what's going on with genetic changes going on in Ebola isolates. And it's just, previously that would have taken years to do a study like that. It took weeks, it just took a couple of weeks. They went immediately impressed. And we're seeing this with other infectious outbreaks and microbial resistance. It's a different world. The same tools for studying the human genome diagnostically can be in a trivial way used to study infectious agents.
Yeah, and it isn't just study though, we need rapid diagnostics that can be used at the bedside immediately. I know Dark was working on this a long time ago, because we collaborated with them, but that's what we need, and we need them now. Louis Pasteur would recognize the way we identify bacteria today, okay? He invented it, all right? And so we have to get beyond that. And again, it's, I think, we don't have the right incentives for diagnostics. Again, they're very important for treating infectious diseases, because you've got to figure out what you're dealing with as soon as possible. And so we won't have good trials until we know immediately what you're dealing with to the extent that we can.
Which is why we continue to develop technologies. I would point out, this is the year, right now, laboratories are just getting the first USB devices, about just a little bit bigger than this, that could be plugged into a laptop and it can sequence the human genome in about a day. It can sequence a microgenome in a matter of hours.
Yeah.
These are brand new technologies that have to be refined and all that, but this is not science fiction anymore. The idea of doing, as you say, in the field on laptop computers as a laboratory is sort of almost within striking distance.
And if you can get that information, then you can get much more quickly to the trials, and then you can get.
That's exactly the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, as far as the outcome measures, which is really what your original question, we've been interested in something that's been discussed in Congress people call it special medical use or limited they're calling it different things whereby we could approve antimicrobials or other drugs based on very limited data set for some of these dire resistant organisms. And then we would have, hopefully there would be some kind of special notification or logo or something like that that would tell the clinical community this is one of these special drugs. Also, request stewardship of that drug, which is of course part of the problem we have now of indiscriminate use of some of these new antimicrobials. So that's on the sort of other end of this, like how do you what is the barrier to get on the market? And with antimicrobials, we have a dreadful situation looming, and we need to find better ways to get them to market, but the diagnostic test would really help. But you also need, and I know this has been discussed a little bit, but in this whole enterprise, okay, discovery is not enough. You've got to have a translational apparatus and clinical trial networks and so forth. You have all the brilliant scientists out there discovering all this stuff, but it somehow has to be reduced to reality and into the clinic and tested efficiently. So.
Yeah, I'm going to go to Dr. Rubinstein.
Hi, I'm Judy Regenstein, I'm a professor of medicine and director of the Center for Women's Health Research at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Center. And these discussion of personalized medicine and discussions of science in general are so exciting. And then you come up against the ceiling and the limitations of the funding of the federal government. And when I see young scientists, we mentor a lot of young scientists, struggling and just suffering to get funded, and there's so much exciting promise, I think what we have to do is make the public more aware of the importance of research. I think the public tends to regard researchers as strange and barren human beings that sit in little laboratories over test tubes, not really related to humanity. I think the more we humanize science, the more powerful we can be, because who votes for people in Congress? The public. And how can the rules be changed so that funding is again available to NIH? It's got to come through the political system, at least in part. And people say, oh, the public can't understand science. This just isn't true. You know, our board, people who work with the center, they get it, they get it. We work on communicating clearly so people understand how important it is. And once they understand, we see attitudes change. We see people funding us and other scientific endeavors. I think it's so critical, and I'm so grateful to Diana for focusing on this kind of thing. So thank you.
I would tell you this, that maybe it's because you might have noticed there's an election going on as well, and when I go around, when I've been going around during the recess, talking to different groups, all kinds of different groups, business groups and political groups and everything, and I talk to them about 21st century cures, citizens really start to get excited because it's sort of what everybody here is saying. They see the potential, and they see the potential for their families and their friends, and so I think there is a way to get people excited.
Well, I point out, I mean, I often say this, when I give talks, I mean, 25 years ago when the Genome Project began, it was for geeky scientists like me. And maybe 10 years ago, 11 years ago when it ended, it was maybe starting to infuse into healthcare professionals, like people sitting around this table. But today, I don't know about in the Denver area, maybe you know, but I know that in the DC area, we have cancer centers who advertise on television, use the word genomics. We have healthcare networks, have all sorts of advertisements. The word genomics is infusing into households through television and through advertisements, and all of a sudden, people hear about it. And I've often said, and I think it's going to likely be the case, that more and more, everybody knows somebody who has cancer, I mean, either your family or your friends, and more, when you start talking about cancer, and you're a patient, you're a family or friend, the word genomics is going to be infused in that conversation, and people, I think, start to put all this together and get very excited.
Yeah, I just say my experience, my patients really like to be in research, but I had to get something back. I would send them the papers, and they'd be so proud that they actually contributed to science. I think that the cystic fibrosis community, for example, you can't find a more committed and involved community, all right? And so it's really actually involving people in this in a way that's meaningful. I think that will bring about what you're looking for, because, as you said, many people have faced disease or know someone who has, but there has to be something given back so that people understand. That's why I think the networks are so important, because they need to involve the patients as well.
Okay, I'm going to close with the rapid fire round. I'd like to have each one of our panelists tell me 2 or 3 things that they'd like to see in concrete things that they'd like to see in this 21st century legislation as we go forward. Because we're really wrapping up. We're getting ready to start drafting the bill. So we'll start with you.
Okay.
Dan, and we'll go right to you.
Number 1, central IRB, at least for federally funded clinical trials. But I do agree, if it's possible politically to have it across the board, that would be even better. Number 2, we need to pool all the data that we have in clinical trials that are completed in an area, in a format that is protecting the human individual, but allowing scientists, clinicians, and other interested parties to mine that data across a variety of platforms, across a variety of drugs, so we can identify fast which patients respond to specific drugs and which patients do not, even in trials that are negative overall. Number 3, I think that we need to basically, just see, I have the 3rd point here. The point, we talked about it, the 3rd point would be is to basically dovetail all clinical trials with drugs with a companion biomarker. And whether we do a companion biomarker that responds to, that predicts response, or one that predicts prognosis in the context of that drug, I think that package has to go together. Because what we'll do by doing that is profile the tumors and also allow diagnostic companies to go back in the context of item 2 that I proposed, which is the National Repository of Results and Molecular Results, to then do validation of additional biomarkers. So companion biomarkers is the 3rd point.
I can be very succinct. These 3 things. One, I want a funding plan for biomedical research in the United States. Notice I'm not calling for doubling,
Right.
I want a long-term plan that we stick with, not going year to year. Long-term plan, good trajectory. Number two, I want a package of things so that the American people feel that participating in research is a great thing to do and that they're safe doing it. And the third thing is I want to be bold and audacious with some big ideas and big programs that everybody can get excited about.
Briefly, and along the lines of what Dr. Green said, I'd like to see a medical school curriculum for how to talk to families and patients about research. All physicians, all nurse practitioners should be able to develop the culture of research. I agree with Dr. Downey also that the electronic medical record is a major issue. Right now, there's one form that dominates the market, 60%, and that means it's very difficult to deal with the other 40%. And then registry and clinical trials networks.
Thank you again for thinking bold. So number one is continue to think bold. What the NIH has accomplished is a study over the last 30, 40 years. And it's an example of work how it works. And giving money to researchers to do great things is helping this country great. And I think all people in the industry believe that, whether it's diagnostics or pharma, it doesn't matter. We support that, and I think we have to find areas where we think government works. So and this is one. Secondly, let's do novel ways in which we can get these products to market quickly. And so we have to think boldly. So we have to have flexible ways in which diagnostics can actually impact it. And then lastly, make sure that we think about, I think industry is a key component to driving innovation outside of where it gets discovered. That's what we do. Innovation is what's going to lower the cost of healthcare over time. It always does. And so make sure that we don't get shut out of the equation because we can't actually ever get some compensation for having done that. So that's three.
Thank you.
So I'll give you three as well. So I agree completely that a
Don't
sustainable,
follow directions.
sometimes, a sustainable funding from the federal government is key, and this notion of excitement is critical. Without, that is the fire that drives this engine. Number two, clear direction and lack of arbitrary decision from CMS, and I hate to say the FDA, they're much better than CMS, but we need clear direction and a path that we all understand the rules, and we'll play by them if we understand them and they're not imposed arbitrarily. Number three, as has been said, don't let us give away our technology. We've devised a game plan. We need to go with this, and we can't let others do what we have invested so heavily in, and basically give away that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. That would be, in my view, the most short-sighted thing.
Well, I have to echo everyone else to say, number one, I think we have to keep driving the science. That's the engine that builds all of this. So, number two, though, I think there needs to be created a robust translational infrastructure in the United States. It's capable, it includes all these things, IRBs, data repositories, registries. Number three, I think if you're going to get that excited, you got to take this to the community. You got to go out to the community docs. People aren't going to get excited about something they're not part of. And you really got to make sure people are part of this, that there are ways to enlist community healthcare in the research enterprise, and we're actually going to need to do that if we're going to get enough patients and enough. So those are the three things I would say.
Could I have a last one? Why?
Yes.
We need more people like you. I mean, I remember 20 years ago, there were far more members of Congress in both chambers that were genuinely interested in science. Their hearings were more extensive. I mean, you have catalyzed this of late, but why have we lost some of our champions in terms of the numbers? And it seems that there's a handful, you're certainly among them, but why is that?
Well, I think that, I think right now in Congress, we can talk more about this, but I think that we're having sort of a generational shift in Congress, and I will actually say, I've been talking to a lot of people about this. I think that there are a number of members, it's sort of like everybody's saying we have to energize the American public. We have to energize members of Congress to thinking that this is a big deal for their constituents. And that's part of what Fred and I are trying to do through this whole endeavor. But as I talk to my colleagues, people are beginning to get excited about the notion that in the next Congress, we could actually do something more than fight about stuff, and that we could actually work on a bipartisan basis. So I'm hopeful that there actually are members of Congress up and coming in the leadership who do care about these issues. And so anyway, I think that's a good place to end. Please help me thank all of our